Inside a cluster of gray warehouses on the edge of Detroit, forklifts were doing something strange, and they kept doing it for almost 3 years straight. Drivers would pick up pallets of aluminum bars, engines groaning under the weight, drive them a few hundred feet across a chain link lot to the building next door, drop them off, clock out, and the next day, drive the same bars right back where they started. The metal never left the property line. It never got sold, never became a soda can or a car door panel or a roll of foil in someone's kitchen drawer. It just went in a circle, slow and pointless, forklift after forklift, day after day, month after month, for the better part of 3 years. And somehow, moving metal in that slow, useless loop was one of the most profitable things a Wall Street bank did that year. Not the trading floor, not the derivatives desk, a parking lot full of forklifts in Detroit. By the time anyone outside the warehouse gates understood what was going on, it had quietly cost ordinary Americans an estimated $5 billion, and almost nobody noticed a thing. This is how a warehouse pulled that off. Start with what a warehouse on the London Metal Exchange actually is, because the word warehouse is doing a lot of lying here. You hear it, and you picture a guy with a clipboard, some dusty shelves, maybe a cat that lives there and everyone's forgotten to name. That is not what this is. The London Metal Exchange runs a global network of licensed storage sites spread across dozens of cities on multiple continents, and every single one of them is a licensed toll booth wearing a warehouse costume. Producers, traders, and investors around the world warrant their metal at these facilities, which just means it gets registered on the exchange's own books as official tradable inventory. A specific stack of bars in a specific bay, in a specific building with a specific document called a warrant that says who owns it. That warrant is itself a tradable thing. Banks and trading houses buy and sell those pieces of paper constantly, without the metal underneath ever physically moving an inch, using them as collateral, packaging them into other deals, treating a stack of aluminum bricks in Detroit the same way you'd treat a stock certificate. And once metal is warranted at one of these sites, the warehouse operator charges rent on it. Every ton, every single day, rain or shine, boom market or bust market, the meter runs and does not stop. It doesn't matter whether the price of aluminum is climbing or falling that week. It doesn't matter whether the global economy is humming or stalling out. As long as the metal sits there, registered, warranted, waiting, the rent keeps landing in the operator's account like clockwork. On paper, this is the most boring line of business you could dream up in the entire industrial world. Storage, basically, with a fee attached. In practice, if you control enough of those boxes, you've built a machine that prints money on autopilot with almost no market risk attached to it. Because the one thing you can always count on is that metal, once it's inside your gate, is extremely good at sitting still. The exchange itself has been running this system since the late 1800s, which means the rulebook governing warehouses had well over a century to get airtight. Copper sits in these warehouses. So does zinc, nickel, tin, and aluminum spread across hundreds of approved sites on several continents, each one supposedly interchangeable. Each one supposedly just a neutral parking spot for metal waiting for its next owner. Nobody who designed that system pictured a single operator turning a storage fee into the main event. Storage was supposed to be the boring part, the part nobody fought over, the part that just quietly kept the gears of global manufacturing turning in the background. That assumption is exactly what made it such fertile ground for somebody patient enough to notice it. Now bring in the bank. In February of 2010, Goldman Sachs bought a company called Metro International Trade Services for somewhere around $550 million. Metro wasn't a metals producer, and it wasn't a trading desk full of screens and shouting. It was a warehouse operator. 27 facilities scattered around Metro Detroit, some of them practically facing each other across the same street, holding something like 1.5 million tons of aluminum between them. Stop on that number for a second, because it barely sounds real until you translate it into something you can picture. 1.5 million tons of aluminum is roughly enough raw metal to stamp out something like 97 billion soda cans. Not the annual output of one factory. Enough cans to hand one to every single person on the planet more than a dozen times over, just sitting in yards in Michigan. And that pile worked out to roughly a quarter of every ton of aluminum registered anywhere in the entire global LME warehouse network. One company, one metro area. a single unglamorous corner of Michigan that most of the country couldn't find on a map, sitting on top of a quarter of the world's exchange-registered aluminum. So the obvious question, the one that should stop you cold if you think about it for even a second, why does an investment bank, a firm that makes its living trading derivatives, underwriting IPOs, pricing risk on instruments most people can't even define, want to own a bunch of sheds full of metal bricks in Michigan? It wasn't the only physical commodity move Goldman made around that period either. In the years after the 2008 financial crash, several of the big Wall Street banks quietly built out physical commodity arms: pipelines, oil tankers, power plants, metals warehousing, treating the unglamorous plumbing of the real economy as a new kind of trading desk, one where owning the pipe mattered more than predicting the price. But warehousing came with something extra that pipelines and tankers didn't: a very particular set of rules attached to it, rules written by the exchange itself to keep the whole system honest. And if you understood those rules better than the people who wrote them, you didn't need a single derivative to make a fortune. You just needed the loopholes sitting in plain sight. The London Metal Exchange, trying to stop its warehouses from ever becoming exactly the kind of bottleneck we're about to describe, had one central obligation baked into every operating license. A warehouse had to release a minimum amount of metal every single day, 1,500 tons, a floor the exchange would keep trying to raise. Whenever a customer showed up wanting their aluminum back, that rule existed for one reason: to keep metal flowing and to stop any single operator from choking the pipe. It was supposed to be the safety valve. Goldman looked at that safety valve and found something else hiding inside it entirely. Here's the move, and it's almost embarrassing how simple it is once you see it laid out flat. To satisfy that 1,500-ton daily load-out requirement, without actually handing much real metal back to outside customers who were waiting on it, Metro started shuffling aluminum between its own 27 warehouses. A load would leave one building. A few hundred feet away sat another Metro warehouse, sometimes visible from the loading dock of the first one, and the truck would simply deliver it there instead. Paperwork says metal moved. Rule says metal moved. Technically, on the books that the exchange audited, the load-out quota got hit, day after day like clockwork. But the aluminum itself never crossed the actual finish line. It never reached a real customer standing at the end of a real purchase order. Never became the raw material sitting on a factory floor waiting to be rolled into cans or stamped into body panels. Loads of 1,500 tons at a time, sometimes shuffled 2 or 3 times in a single day, round and round between buildings that in some cases you could walk between in under a minute. Traders who worked with the facility described watching the same trucks, sometimes the same drivers, make the same short loop day after day, delivering nothing anywhere except back to where it started. And here's what that carousel actually did to the people who genuinely needed the metal. The waiting line to withdraw aluminum from Metro's warehouses, which used to run somewhere around 40 to 60 days back before Goldman bought in, stretched out past 600 days. Over a year and 8 months between placing your withdrawal order and actually getting metal in your hands. Imagine ordering something and being told it ships in 6 weeks, and then watching that estimate crawl out to 20 months, while the warehouse insists on paper, in its filings to the exchange, that it's moving product every single day without fail. And remember the toll booth from a minute ago? It doesn't stop charging rent just because the line got absurdly long. Roughly 40 cents a ton per day on every single ton sitting in that queue, whether it moved in a circle that morning or not. Run the math on 600 days of that rate and you sail past $200 of accumulated rent per ton with no ceiling in sight, nothing built into the system to cap it, nothing forcing the line to shrink. The longer the queue stretched, the more the toll booth collected on the exact same metal, sitting in the exact same spot going nowhere. The dysfunction wasn't a side effect of the business model. Once you look at the incentives closely enough, the dysfunction basically was the business model. Inside the industry, people started calling it exactly what it looked like from the outside: the aluminum shuffle or the merry-go-round, depending on who you asked. And it wasn't subtle if you knew where to stand and watch. Some of Metro's 27 warehouses sat close enough to each other that a driver could make the round trip in the time it takes to eat lunch. The same forklifts, the same loading docks, the same short stretch of pavement, worn smoother by the week. None of it required anyone to falsify a single document because nothing about it was false. The metal really did move. It really did get logged weighed, and recorded exactly the way the rule demanded. The only thing missing from the transaction was a customer standing at the other end actually receiving anything they could use. It was compliance in its most literal possible form, technically flawless and functionally hollow. And that combination is precisely what makes it so hard to prosecute and so easy to defend in a hearing room. Which brings us to the part of this story that should genuinely bother you, because it isn't really about Goldman's balance sheet. It's about your grocery bill and your car payment and every six-pack you've ever bought. Here's the paradox sitting right in the middle of the whole thing. Out on the open market, on the London Metal Exchange's public price screen, the headline price of aluminum was going nowhere. Flat, occasionally sliding, the picture of a perfectly unremarkable, well-supplied commodity that nobody needed to worry about. But there's a second price that most people never think about. And it's the one that actually determines what a factory pays to get real, physical metal delivered into its own hands. Traders call it the Midwest Premium. And while the headline price on the screen sat still, the Midwest Premium went vertical, climbing in a way that had nothing to do with how much aluminum existed on the planet. Back in 2010, before the Q exploded, that premium sat around 5 cents a pound. By 2013, it had climbed to a record 12 to 13 cents a pound. By January of 2014, it hit a record 20.5 cents a pound, 4 times higher than where it started in under 4 years, while the exchange price of the underlying metal barely moved an inch. The aluminum existed. Nobody was claiming a shortage of raw ore in the ground or a shutdown at the smelters. The problem was access. The metal was sitting right there physically inside Metro's fenced yards, and you simply could not get your hands on it without waiting out a queue that had ballooned into a year and a half, sometimes longer, no matter how badly your factory line needed it. Scarcity of patience had become, for pricing purposes, functionally identical to scarcity of supply, and the market charged accordingly. That gap between the flat exchange price and the soaring physical premium didn't stay trapped in a spreadsheet in Detroit. It rode straight through the supply chain into every single product that had aluminum anywhere inside it. Every soda can on a grocery shelf, the car door panel and engine block rolling off an assembly line, the roll of foil sitting in your kitchen drawer. A single aluminum can holds something like 14 grams of metal, which sounds like nothing worth mentioning. A fraction of a cent per can once you translate the premium down to that scale. But multiply that fraction by the tens of billions of cans Americans buy every single year. Then stack on every car built with aluminum parts. Then stack on every other manufactured product that touches this metal somewhere in its supply chain. And that invisible rounding error turns into real, national, added up and gasp money. MillerCoors, yes, the company that makes the beer that goes in the can, actually sent a witness to testify in front of the United States Senate that these warehouse rules were adding an extra $3 billion a year to what aluminum buyers across the entire country had to pay, just from this one distortion, according to their own testimony. Not spread thin over some vague multi-year window. $3 billion every single year it persisted, by one major buyer's own estimate. String several years of that together, factor in every industry that touches aluminum. Can makers, brewers, automakers, foil producers, appliance manufacturers, anyone whose supply chain ever needed to physically take delivery of the metal. And outside estimates of the total damage absorbed by consumers between 2010 and 2013 landed north of $5 billion. $5 billion extracted not through a hack, not through counterfeit metal, not through anything that looked remotely like theft on a police report. Extracted through forklifts driving in slow circles and a rulebook that never once imagined anyone would read it quite this literally. Nobody who bought a car or cracked open a can during those years got a receipt marked Warehouse Premium. The cost didn't announce itself. It just quietly rode along inside a price tag that already looked normal. Eventually, somebody noticed, and it took a while because nothing about a warehouse queue looks like a crime scene from the outside. In July of 2013, a New York Times reporter named David Kocieniewski published an investigation that pulled the curtain back on what warehouse insiders had already started calling the shuffle, traders, brokers, and manufacturers describing, on the record, exactly how loads moved building to building without ever leaving the system, and exactly how that movement kept the premium climbing. That story detonated across the metals industry and dragged an arrangement that had been running quietly for years into full public daylight. Then, in November of 2014, the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator Carl Levin, held public hearings and released a lengthy report digging into how bank ownership of physical commodity infrastructure, warehouses, pipelines, storage terminals, the unglamorous plumbing of the real economy, had quietly reshaped markets that regular households depend on every single day without ever knowing those markets existed. Goldman wasn't the only bank the subcommittee looked at either. Other Wall Street firms that had built out their own physical commodity units around the same era got pulled into the same set of hearings. The same uncomfortable questions about whether a bank should be allowed to own the pipes it also trades through. But the aluminum warehouses, and Metro specifically, were the headline case, the one with a number attached that regular people could actually feel in a grocery aisle. And here's where the story needs to be told exactly straight, because it would be easy and satisfying, and honestly kind of fun, to turn this into a simple villain narrative with a bow on top. That is not what actually happened, and the difference matters. Goldman's defense consistently, across the reporting and the hearings, was that the price of aluminum and its premium were set by ordinary global supply and demand, that the long queues reflected legitimate demand from traders and investors who genuinely wanted to store metal for their own financial reasons, and that Metro International had operated within the letter of the London Metal Exchange's own rules the entire time, start to finish. And here's the detail that tends to catch people off guard once they actually hear it laid out. Goldman Sachs was never criminally charged over any part of this. Not the bank, not Metro. As a subsidiary, not a single named executive. Goldman sold Metro International in December of 2014, stepping cleanly out of the physical warehouse business it had entered less than 5 years earlier. The London Metal Exchange rewrote its load-out rules in 2015, specifically engineered to close the loophole that had allowed the shuffle to work in the first place. And when groups of consumers and manufacturers filed lawsuits over the billions in extra costs they said they'd absorbed, those suits were dismissed by the courts in 2016. The plaintiffs weren't able to establish the legal standing the law required to prove they'd been directly and provably harmed in the specific way antitrust law recognizes. So say the honest version of this plainly, because it's the entire point of telling the story at all. None of what you just heard was ever ruled illegal. Not a crime in any court that mattered. Not fraud in any legal sense that actually stuck to anyone involved. The shock here was never that someone broke the law and slipped away with it. The shock is that they never had to break it in the first place. And that's the part of the story that actually sticks with you once the forklifts stop moving and the headlines fade back into old newspaper archives. The asset here was never really the aluminum. 27 sheds full of metal bricks in Detroit, sitting on their own, gathering dust. That's not power, that's just inventory under a roof, worth exactly what the metal weighs and nothing more. The real asset, the thing actually worth $550 million, was the choke point. The gate. Whoever controls the one narrow doorway that everything else is legally required to pass through gets to charge a toll on every single thing that goes by. And they get to do it entirely inside the rules, because they were never breaking the rules to begin with. They built their entire strategy around reading those rules more carefully, more literally, more patiently than anyone else in the room ever bothered to. A licensed LME warehouse, stripped down to its studs, is nothing more than a toll booth bolted onto the world's aluminum supply, dressed up in a clipboard and a loading dock so it doesn't look like one. The genius of it, or the horror of it, depending entirely on which side of the toll booth you happen to be standing on, was never in bending a single regulation until it snapped. It was in understanding those regulations so thoroughly that a rule literally written to keep metal flowing freely could be turned, quietly, patiently, into the exact mechanism that slowed it to a crawl. You'll notice this same shape show up again and again once you know what to look for, in places that have nothing to do with aluminum. It's the toll road that only makes real money when traffic backs up. It's the ticketing platform that charges you more the closer the show gets to selling out. Look closely, and you'll find any system where the rulebook was written to guarantee flow, and somebody figured out that friction, not flow, was where the actual money lived. None of that requires villains twirling mustaches in a boardroom. It just requires somebody patient enough to read the fine print until they find the one clause everybody else assumed was harmless. 600 days in a queue that used to take 6 weeks. 20.5 cents a pound at a register that used to run 5. One number to carry out of this whole story if you only keep one. It cost the country an estimated $5 billion to learn that the person who owns the door doesn't need to steal a single thing off the shelf behind it. They just need to make you wait long enough that the waiting itself becomes the product. So, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read all of them. And if a warehouse full of forklifts driving in circles for a year and a half, quietly draining an estimated $5 billion out of the country's grocery bill without breaking a single law, is the kind of thing that grabs you, hit subscribe, and smash the like button on your way out.